Okay then, well, with that, get this one started. So welcome everyone to our final workstream event of the year. This is the kickoff for the Workforce 100 workstream, and I'm very excited to be bringing together the perspectives today, having worked in the space for a while. I think this might be the first time that we've had such an incredible crew from all these different perspectives all in one conversation. So very excited about that. To help frame up the conversation a little bit for today, just so that everyone has kind of a shared frame of reference where we're starting from. I think each of you did share what's the wicked problem that you're tackling into. We'll make sure to tackle those as part of our questions and really engage you in some conversation here as we go forward. In this dialogue itself, I would also love to flag up a little bit of, well, where are we starting at today? What's the starting context for, there we go, for where we're at, and the stats that we have just on the Center for Sustainable Business community, just so that we have a kind of common frame of reference of where are we starting today, and as we close out 2021 after everything of the past months, that we've got some folks in the center community that have a variety of different policies, from anti-slavery policies to inclusion policies, things about gig workers and contractors, equity and payments, retention disclosures, and whether or not the people there say that they are a great workplace. So that's kind of on the programs front. Juxtapose that with what is people's lived realities. We have some opportunities, we have some gaps to close, even as we, in academia, are thinking about what does thriving work for all look like, figuring out what are the right metrics to track, is an ongoing piece of our conversation. So with that, I'm very excited to bring up the conversation today amongst our panelists, and you've seen their bios, so I won't waste our conversation time and question time with giving the bios, but I will tee up for each of our speakers here the perspective. So first up, we've got Valerie from the Roosevelt Project, the lead author there. It's an amazing bit of research about the just transition to a clean and circular economy. So for those of us based here in the Southwest Pennsylvania and Appalachia, Marcellus area, Valerie, your work is very apropos, top of mind for folks about what does work look like going forward. So what are some of the wicked problems that you're seeing when we think about thriving work for all?
Great, yeah, thanks, Chris. So I think it's probably pretty clear that climate change is front and center in a lot of the national discussions, and we face a gigaton challenge at the national level, but also at the global level. So we need to bring down GHG emissions, but a key question is, how can we do this in a way that doesn't leave any of our fossil energy specialized communities behind? And so the question, I think, the wicked problem is figuring out how to find a way for today's workforce to see themselves in a transformed clean energy and circular economy future. And that's just to sort of put some numbers with that challenge. I think, in many of these communities, those who are directly employed by fossil energy, mining, et cetera, are generally a very small share of the overall population, less than 2%, but they enable a huge amount of activity in an energy cluster. So sometimes, 3 to 10 times the number of jobs that are represented by that small share are potentially affected if we can't get this problem solved. And I think that, thinking about that 2% of workers is really, really important, because it's not just those workers, it's their families, it's also thinking about those skill sets and how they translate. And there will be a number of opportunities, our research shows, for moving into clean energy technologies that are compatible with those skill sets that, for example, in construction, a number of different jobs. And so we're hopefully at the beginning of something big on figuring this one out. And so this is all work we're doing now at Carnegie Mellon. I'm in the engineering and public policy department, and this is a big topic on our minds right now. Thanks, Chris.
Awesome. Thank you, Valerie. Much appreciated. And so with that, we'd love to juxtapose that to kind of break us out of our shells a little bit and how we think about our workforce is, if nothing else, over the past 18 months, we've noticed that when our gig workers have problems, there are problems. When our suppliers have problems, there are problems. And so, with that thinking, Jessica, would love to bring you into the conversation, because the work that you all do in slave-free trade, really diving into, what does not even like thriving work look like, but what does at least decent work look like for those the humans that we rely on to do the day-to-day of everything we do.
Yeah, thank you, Chris, and great to be here. So our challenges, let's talk about the quality of human rights in the workplace and how can we make that more transparent, how to be more proactively driving these decent workforces. Let me bring that a bit in perspective. Slavery, you all read about it in your history books. Did you know 40 million people still work in modern slavery? That's the same as the population of California. Almost 160 million of children are exposed to child labor. Almost 2.5 times the number of children living in Europe. 1 out of 10 of children is exposed to child labor. And with the impact of COVID, there's an expected another 9 million more children to be at risk of slavery. And 77% of the businesses actually believe that modern slavery exists somewhere in their chain. Mind-blowing numbers. We touch modern slavery every day, and what we eat, what we drink, what we wear, the houses we live in, the office we work in, the cars we drive, and the phones and the laptops we use every day. In 2003, our founder, Brian Iselin, as federal agent, investigated the death of a 12-year-old Khmer child, trafficked to Thailand, who was shot in the head, as well as his 2 friends, and dumped overboard from a prawning boat because the boat was simply full at the end of the season. The captain sold the prawns, and through a lot of layers in the supply chain, the prawns ended up in a European supermarket, bought by consumers who had no idea. There are 3 times more people suffering in slavery actually today than more during the entire 400 years of transatlantic slave trade. It's a massive socioeconomic problem, and we know so little about it. So how to make that more transparent? That's a big challenge, and how to drive a world where things are made in freedom. Sure, there's a lot of done by federal agents like Brian to solve it, but more looking at it from a criminal justice. It's fixing something, but not the cause of it. We see a lot of increased activity, of course, in governments, policies, organizations, more demand for transparency, but that's a lot through standards and legislation. Track and trace auditing, absolutely good starts, but they don't really give the voice of the workforce themselves. It's looking at origins of goods, not so much about how the environment has been. And then there is not enough independent efforts on the consumer, the buyer, the investor side to demand light and proof of true working conditions in which goods are made, so they can make a good choice between an ethical or a non-ethical product when they procure. 67% of the consumers want to switch products if they learn it's made through modern slavery. So the true challenge is actually twofold: drive transparency about human rights at the workplace through the voice of the workforce and how to do that, and to change real behavior through a preference-driven market. So a lot of challenges. Back to you, Chris.
Perfect. Thank you, Jessica. I appreciate that framing. And Tony, with that, I think that squares up to you to bring us back. Okay, well, and so when we're at our worst, right, so some of the really wicked problems, but even thinking more close to home, what does it take? What are some of the wicked problems that's really impeding great workplaces for all, even here in the US or around the world? What are you seeing?
Yeah, great question, Chris. So we're seeing some lingering challenges that have been around for a long period of time. One is fairness in the workplace. And we are really focusing right now on trying to figure out how do we create equity and representation, equity and compensation, equity and opportunities, and now with the pandemic, equity and well-being. And prior to the pandemic, if you look at the workforce, there was always this issue of fairness and how fairness is perceived in the workforce. 53% of the Black employees in the workforce feel like things aren't fair, compared to 73% for Caucasians. And there's this gap because leaders are 5 to 8 times more likely to think that things are fair. And so there's this perception that things are fair, but still we find out that people aren't experiencing that way. And then with the pandemic, it's created even greater challenges. There's a huge percentage of employees who are feeling burnout. About 22% of the population are feeling burned out. But if you look at that by different groups, there's like 43% of the Black females that are feeling that way, 37% of the Asian females. And so this sense of fairness in the workplace, as well as how people are experiencing it from a well-being perspective, are huge challenges. And so how do we create more equity in representation, compensation, opportunities, but also well-being are the challenges that we're struggling with.
Got it. Thank you, Tony. Much appreciated. And Mona, before passing it over to you, I'll do one housekeeping note that I completely forgot to mention earlier for folks around. We do have the Q&A function in there, so I would encourage folks, as you're hearing all the great conversations going on so far, please do start dropping in your questions in the Q&A. We'll be bringing them up here later in the conversation. But with that, Mona, I would love to hand it over to you. So we've had three very different framings. And so as someone working in the industries, in work, in both a B2B kind of company, but also B2C, also retail, also supply chain, just touches a lot, and one of the largest employers in the globe. So, Mona, what's been your experience as far as the wicked problems that are really impeding this kind of thriving work for all?
No, absolutely. I think, each one of us has kind of touched points that are all relevant to food services, especially because we touch so many kind of lines of work. Food service kind of touches, all the way from the farmers to the distributor, to the trucking, to all of it coming to the warehouse, to the retailers, like you said. But you also look at the unemployment rate in the restaurant industry, and it's, I think, at about 7%. And while you look at the open job opportunities that there are, the number is just staggering. And a lot of it is related to the food and beverage and hospitality industry. I think, most certainly we've seen a significant number remove themselves in a way from the workforce, of course, due to COVID, post, pandemic, and haven't come back even yet. It's about 24 months in, and, we still haven't seen that kind of number come back. In a restaurant location that I know, only 80% of their workforce returned. Some people often say 80% is quite a lot, but it's actually not, given the shortage that we have, given the enormous, food production that goes on. It's just so difficult to hire staff post-pandemic as well. I've worked in retail, like you said, B2B, B2C. I've just seen shortages throughout. But is this chronic sort of hiring struggle, we refer to it as labor shortage, and I often ask myself this as well, can it be more accurately pinpointed to something else? Perhaps is it being pinpointed toward, lack of decent work, and it's just not labor shortage, right? Some answers that we've seen companies come out and say, yes, we're raising the wage, with, providing XYZ kind of remuneration, we're providing, great packages for a 401k plan or such things, but is that the solution? And is it helping? I did kind of research yesterday and saw that it didn't really matter. So what is it that people are actually looking for? As an example, during the pandemic, I think Tony raised some really good stats as well with females. We saw that there were so many women actually who would say, okay, we can't come to work because we need to be with our children who now have virtual schooling. Food services is an industry that you can't really work from home. You have to be there preparing the food and such things. So it really posed that threat to us, and that's where gig economy kind of rose as well. But there were challenges there too. So how are we bridging this gap, and are we even doing anything yet? There's a long way to go. Certainly, I think we saw it from the stats that you put up as well. Equity, DE&I. Really top of mind, even for us. I'm really proud to say that at Chartwells, we have a really strong kind of women-based leadership, which is lovely to see, and so happy to be part of it. But I think it goes a long way when we need to come together through all these kind of food service organizations. There's quite a lot of us, right? So what are we doing? And how do is this, again, I always say this, I think my biggest challenge and problem is it a labor shortage, or is it really lack of decent work and pay and equity and things like that?
Thank you, Mona. Much, much appreciated. And so this is the part where we bring everybody back on stage, and we have a little bit of a conversation here amongst the panelists. Looking for popcorn back and forth between you all to kick us off, get us started. So I know each of us have touched a little bit about I think on recently, but Valerie, I'd love to circle it back to you to start us off. Mona was just talking about a lot of the challenges that food service not being something that you can do remote work on, right? And a lot of these energy jobs in transition are ones that you can't really do remotely, right? There's a lot that's in person. So I'm curious, how has lockdowns or COVID, or however you want to think about it, how have the past 2 years, what kind of impact have they had on this just transition? What are you seeing as far as trying to help people in that transition, or what problems has it exacerbated?
Yeah, well, I think like in food service, the energy industry has experienced a really sort of sharp, short-lived perhaps, but sharp downturn in terms of end user demand, in terms of the way the industry can operate under lockdown. So navigating those challenges has obviously been very tough. I think it's also prompted longer term thinking about, so how can we build a more resilient energy industry as we make it cleaner, as we address some of these other challenges? And I think that, in terms of connections with all of the points that have been raised so far this morning, I think an important one is that these challenges don't exist in isolation, even though we each have our own expertises. And so I think what's really an interesting question is how do you make progress on multiple fronts simultaneously and still keep stakeholders engaged? I mean, if you think about it on the modern slavery issue, do we, as we encourage our supply chains to go greener, do we sacrifice effort on other fronts? For example, just workplaces and thinking about engaging or auditing labor practices? I hope not. I really hope not. And I think that's something that keeps me up at night.
Thanks, Bob. And so, Jessica, I don't know if you want to pick up there. That was kind of a nice segue of as we're transitioning to a cleaner economy and shifting where we're supplying or sourcing things from, different geographies, different countries, different human practices. I don't know if that's impacting any of the problems that you're seeing, or any of the wicked problems of where stress is being added.
Yeah, and I think it's absolutely true. We've seen a lot of, if you look at the ESG, big term, everybody talks about it, but it's a lot about the environmental part. It's about that sustainability. That's also where, if you look at the auditing quite often used to provide transparency in supply chains, it's often about track and tracing a component material to make sure where it came from and what it's made of, and is it indeed sustainably made, but not looking at the true voices of the workforce. And I think that's not even negotiable. It's good we have the E part, but there is so much more work to be done on the social element to make sure we have the right working environment, conditions for people to work in. It cannot be a trade-off. And maybe that's also the difficult element, because you have to choose. You can't do it all at the same time. But I think we need to not lose perspective of the effect of working conditions on human beings. Coming back also to what Mona was talking about, the labor shortage, and what is it really about? Is it indeed, do we provide the right work conditions and work environment for employees to work in, to feel comfortable, to be treated fairly and respectfully and with dignity? It's a complex topic to try to deal with all of it at the same time, but I think ultimately it's all about people. We cannot underestimate the power of people. The whole economy based on people. So let's make sure we give them let's listen to them and give them the right conditions to work in. But it's complex, and I think maybe also for, I don't know whether you, Mona, or maybe you, Tony, would like to take that up, but it's, are we listening enough to the people in giving them the transparency and the right environment to voice their opinion, not to be afraid of their job or anything else? Yeah, difficult.
Yeah, I would agree, Jessica. I feel like now all of our research is really focused on the leader, because the leader is so important in this conversation, and having a leader that builds trust with everyone. And now is an opportunity for leaders to step up and show up in a different way. We have to figure out, how do we give people more agency? An hourly employee doesn't have the flexibility of a salaried employee, but somehow we have to give them more flexibility in scheduling. We have to give them more resources in the way of helping them from a well-being perspective. And I think all of this centers around the person that they report to, that people leader. And so we know that that either makes or breaks the relationship within an organization. And it's a great time for leaders to sort of rethink, how do they lead people and what is their role as a leader? And it's not the person who is going to be self-focused and hubris, but more engaging other people and getting things done, being more empathetic. And when you show up that way, we see a big difference, because it's a huge opportunity with hourly employees. They're 33% more likely to experience burnout than salaried employees. And so we really have to focus on that. And I think it starts with the leader.
No, I agree 100%. And, while you were telling, how powerful all of that is, the only thing I could think of is how belonging itself is so powerful as well. And I know most of our early associates always want to have that sense of belonging, and we want to give that, because you'll have that higher retention rate. You're going to have that lower kind of burnout as well. Turnover rates, I think, especially post-pandemic, has been so high. I've seen so many new employees come and go, which is why gig economy came up, but also, what are we doing to make them feel like they belong to the company? They have part of, you own it. This is your workplace as well as much as it's mine. I think the industry is going towards that as well. Lots more to go, definitely. But, giving that sense of belonging to them, I think, is really important. And Jessica earlier kind of raised the complexity of, just not certifications and what's in supply chain in general. It's just massive. Your little piece of, I'm going to use chocolate, love chocolate, but that little piece of chocolate that you're going to have, what goes behind that is just so complex. You're going to look into certifications. Is that certification looking at what you're looking at as well? Is a different thing. I may be more biased towards looking at, eradicating slavery. Someone else might look, okay, I want to say that they're, getting their fair wage, but it's, again, what's your perspective? Which certification would you be looking at is so key. I face this all the time when I'm looking at carbon emissions for sustainability. So which emission factor is really important to you may not be what's important to me. It's totally different as well when your perspective is what counts. And then I think food services and restaurants and hospitality in general, what's happened is they've advanced equity in the marketplace through bringing those, they're adding more companies that are owned by women. They're adding more historically marginalized people to their supply network. That's certainly you've seen the shift, and I have seen it in the last 10 years alone. Even marketing to consumers with more inclusive messaging has come across now. So there's slowly improvements, definitely, but I think to understand the problem is just so complex, which is why we're here, in the breakfast primer. But you just can get deviated, I think, in so many different directions, and then you just go roundabout.
Brilliant. Thank you, Mona. Jessica, you look like you want to weigh in there, maybe with a final thought?
Yeah, could I? Because it's both actually to what Tony and Mona were saying. Yes, it's all about leading by example, and it's about making sure that you indeed look after your workforce. If everybody would be doing that, we would be in a different situation. But it's also, I believe there's also a role to play from us as consumers, from us as procurement, from us as investors. making the choices. And of course, the complexity is, how do you know what's right or what's wrong? So then we come back to, we need to have human rights standards to talk about really the working conditions of employees, of the workforce, and not about the supply chain and whether it's organic or not material. It's about, you know, how were the people treated in the field? But how do you know about that when you're an investor? There's 150 billion profits per year made in slavery. 77% of companies say they believe there is some form of slavery. $150 billion of profit per year. There is a lot of consumer movement within that. So as consumers, as buyers, as investors, we have a role to play. So leading by example, but it's we need to have both elements to make that happen, and say, I don't buy if you cannot prove your workforce is treated fairly. And I think that brings a lot of power to driving it through the value chain and coming back to, indeed, how do you prove your workforce is treated fairly? But it's a big challenge.
Yeah, I totally agree. I go back to that blind spot that our data shows when it comes to fairness. I think as consumers, we have a blind spot. We may assume that things are one way and not really understand. So I totally agree. How do we become more conscious consumers is a big part of it.
So Tony, I think that tees it up quite well. We actually have, so I'm going to preference the questions that we're getting via the Q&A because it's a little bit easier to tackle them versus the chat, but we will get some ones in the chat too. So we did have a question come in from Cody in the Q&A around, and my thinking, Tony, is that this might be most appropriate to, but I'm sure each of the others could touch on it as well, around, you know, what kind of impacts are you seeing from whether it's technology or generational trends, right? Or maybe different industries, right? New industries coming up like creator economy or influencer marketing that might be exacerbating either the wickedness of the problems or maybe chipping away and helping us get towards solutions.
In terms of the energy workforce, I think that I'm actually seeing a lot of chipping away at the problem itself, in the sense that you have communities where young people might have gone into sort of the same jobs that their parents and grandparents had done in, I think of coal mining, but there are many other examples. And now, because there are, in many cases, local, sort of creative, entrepreneurial, hands work, makerspace type, sort of the whole gamut of options for them, there are ways that they can explore and see alternative futures from a very early age. And so I think this is really important, because the workforce challenge in energy is going to be addressed, one worker, one community at a time, and everybody's situations are going to be somewhat different. At the same time, we want to think about, as we think about building the workforce of the future, it's these types of entrepreneurial, particularly, I think we want to think, outside the coasts, think about different manifestations of entrepreneurship, of these types of activities that can really work in places that haven't seen, a lot of entrepreneurial activity. We saw in our work that actually in the places that are facing some of the toughest impacts of energy transition, potential job losses, they also don't get much of the venture capital and much of the attention, much of the spotlight. How can that change? What can we do to change that? I think it requires rethinking what entrepreneurship can look like.
I would say one thing that we see from a generational trend is that there's a different expectation of people in the workforce that's sort of nudging companies, nudging leaders to see things in a different way, which is it's improving the wicked challenges that we're dealing with. And so I feel like that's showing up in a great way. And I feel like young people are looking for places to work that serves a purpose, not just necessarily looking for a brand or a company by name, but looking for a company that really lives a purpose that aligns with their purpose. And so I feel like that's something that's pushing everyone to think deeply about what is the purpose of the work that you do? how do you really live into that purpose? And that's a good thing that's coming from a generational push.
Just to pitch in 2 seconds on that, because it's actually interesting to see that technology is driving more slavery. It's easier to find people, and you can do and trace, track and trace your people much quicker than you could do 400 years ago. You're able to mobilize people much quicker. So it's actually driving more towards potential indecent workplaces than it actually should help. Looking at the influencer market, I mean, that could be a massive boost, provided it's indeed used in the right way, right and wrong. So it both has 2 sides of it. Interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, I think, similar kind of thought as well. It has 2 sides, definitely. And I think restaurants and hospitality as well. I'll use, Grubhub and like these seamless deliveries as an example. The uptick that we've seen post-pandemic and the new technology coming into that. It's great that there's new technology coming in, new markets, emerging markets and such things, but it's also taking away some jobs. So how do we weigh that, and how does that equate in the end? And that's why I kind of resonate really heavily with what Jessica said, that it's actually driving and going towards slavery in some places. They're not, sometimes not tipped well, sometimes not paid well. So I think that shift is there as well. There's obviously a negative and positive to everything that we do. But I think definitely I've seen this firsthand as well. A couple of my friends work for Grubhub, and they always tell me of how, they were so bored during the pandemic. So they just picked up this driver and delivery kind of gigs there. And they would always tell me as to, some people just don't tip. And they're so reliant on wages. And I don't know how, if wages really will be surprised in the end. So I think 2 schools of thought there as well. Just wanted to add that.
That's a great point. I'm thinking
Awesome.
about some small restaurant owners that I know, and the margins are so slim anyway. And now the supplies are so hard to get that the price is going up on that. So the margins are getting even slimmer. And then when you have other parties delivering food, it just cuts it further and further and further. So how do you take care of your people when you're just making such slim margins?
Yeah, but is that, again, not a role for the consumer as well? It cannot be that if you had a choice between the prawns in the supermarket, which has a red cross on it because it's with their fishing boat from the 12-year-old boy, etc., or you have a prawns bag in the supermarket where indeed it has a nice stamp on it for which it's made under the right conditions. Even if there's studies done, 79% would not mind paying a bit more if that would be needed. It's all about transparency. We don't know. We don't know what's behind it because we don't have that transparency. We don't have a mean to find out whether it's decent produced or not. And I think that's an essence of the challenge we deal with. If you don't know, you choose something that looks nice and maybe there is some labels on it, where it's bought, but you don't know how it's made. And I think that's certainly a complexity.
Sure. So love the conversation and love the brilliant questions that are continuing to come in through the Q&A function. So we're going to keep trying to tackle as many of them as we can. There's a very wicked question that came in about wicked problems from Matt Evans. As a Carnegie Mellon alum now working in a Center for Sustainable Business, data is front of mind for me. So I'm very keen on Matt Evans' question around, is there an overarching metric that you'd suggest a company use to answer the question, are we providing thriving work for all? Is there one KPI that we should all be focused on? And what do folks think?
Yeah, can I kick off with the answer for this? Because I think it's a complex, it's a very, very valid question, because what's decent for me might not be decent for someone elsewhere. And I think that's sort of already driving a difficulty. So with slave-free trade, we have come up with a standard, which is about human rights framework for decent work, combining all the international standards and looking at the ones specifically for human rights. And that's an indicator, but it's very true. There is no one single indicator today, and maybe that's also work to be done to move towards a more single indicator or the right standards for human rights, and then listen to the workforce, not by auditing, because then we're not solving the problem either. But it's indeed true. To the best of my knowledge, there is not a single number that will tell you right or wrong.
I would completely agree with that. I think you need to track a lot of indicators as much as you can, reasonably handle along these multiple dimensions. At the same time, you don't want to overly focus on any one indicator in driving a program longer term, because that could, first of all, you'll get laser focused on one metric at the expense of others, and you also want to be tracking how those, if and when those trade-offs start to occur. I think it's really important that you work with metrics, but also with the holistic picture of how your organizational culture is evolving around these issues, and also continuously trying to surface what's not being said or not being heard, especially around diversity, equity, and inclusion issues, because those are, I think you can sometimes overemphasize metrics, and I'm moving away from my energy wheelhouse here, but I do think that this is important in the energy space as well as more broadly.
Tony, I feel like you might have a wealth of knowledge to be able to address on this one. Is there one number that should be an overarching metric for whether or not we're providing thriving work for all, or like Jessica and Valerie mentioned, like focusing on one, it depends. You look at the numbers underneath, or maybe it varies a bit by context. What's been your experience?
Yeah, that's a really great question, because we have key metrics. We look at whether or not your experience workplace is a great place to work, and that's a great number. But if you look underneath it, people say it's a great place to work, and on top of that, they say it's not fair. And so there's a disconnect there. And so I would go back to what Mona is saying. I think the sense of belonging right now is really, really important. And so if I had to measure anything related to diversity, equity, inclusion, I would somehow capture whether or not individuals feel like they have a sense of belonging in the workplace. Because when they do, it has implications on so many other things. And so that's something that I would focus on. I'm not sure how I would measure it, but that's definitely a key area.
Awesome. Well, one other really big one that might be of interest for folks that kind of came in, because it touches a bit on what we were just talking about, is how do we reconcile differences in culture in putting together the standards for decent work, right? So isn't it just the most dominant culture? That's what we should go by, right? Because in some places, for example, child labor is acceptable, but most places it's not. So how, as we try and work forward through solving this, how are each of you working through that, the effort across cultures?
Yeah, I think, Chris, we need to be careful with this, because it's a very complex question that we can't explain even if we had more time, because it's very difficult to have a single opinion. At the same time, child labor, we talk about extortion, we talk about not going to school, it should not be tolerated. And maybe that's whether you live in country A or country B. If you're younger than 15 years, you need to be able to get education. And that doesn't mean you can't work, because then we come to these farmers with their families, and sure, that's part of, we all had a job when we were 12 and made some money, but we also had our education. And I think we just need to find standards which are, to the best possible way, internationally acceptable. And it cannot be that we believe that child labor is acceptable in certain countries and it's not in others. We just need to define also what child labor means. if they don't get education in their 8 years, we have a big problem. You know, if they are 12 and they work at the farm, but also get education and etc. So then it's a complex topic, but it should be ideally internationally aligned. But maybe that's too big a dream I may have.
Sure. And Tony, I think this is an area where you and the team at Great Place to Work have had some noodling around on what makes a great workplace internationally, right? So, presence in a lot of different markets globally, and thinking, well, what makes a globally a great workplace? What are your thoughts on trying to reconcile a number or a standard across different cultures?
Yeah, I agree with Jessica. It's very complex. It's not an easy thing to do. And we're in 97 different countries, but we find that there's more similarities across the world than differences. And so really our main focus is on how do you experience the workplace with the person that you report to, your leader, and the people that you work with. And so we find that to be pretty consistent across the globe. But coming up with, I don't have a great answer because I think it's very complex. And so some of the issues we're dealing with around diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging in the US is totally different around the globe. And so we're struggling with figuring out how does that show up in another country, because it's not like what we have here. But there is that sense of belonging that I mentioned earlier, where everyone, regardless of the environment you're in, something creates a sense of belonging. And if we can focus on that, I think that's a common thing.
Sure. So Valerie, we have one question in here that I think is right up your alley, expressly to you. So the majority and per the question, oil and gas companies in the US are moving slower to diversify their energy portfolios. Workers in the petroleum industry do believe that their skills are valuable and no urgent need to reskill. What are your thoughts on that reskilling aspect in there?
Great, yeah. So I think this is you could see it as kind of a complicated multi-part questions. I'll try to kind of keep it focused on just a couple key points. It's true that the US majors have moved more slowly on climate change and on transforming their business models. But I think that the writing is now on the wall and many of them are moving. So, Chevron has announced its new energies business. There have been a number of other announcements. Engine number one, sending clear messages, I think, to ExxonMobil and others. So it's the US majors are now kind of catching up with Europe on this front. I think, and this of course goes beyond just the oil and gas companies. There's certainly in coal and electric power, there's some similar trends. I think what's challenging is that, so for workers in those industries, I think you have to take a differentiated approach to transitioning different groups within that workforce, right? So there are young people who might have gone into that industry. That's where you need sort of a broader set of alternatives. There are also a number of skill sets, pipe fitting, construction, chemistry. A lot of these technologies can actually be used in the context of a clean energy economy. You think about using hydrogen as a potential fuel and energy carrier. There's a number of ways that this can enable those skills to continue to be to work in today's in the transformed energy system, right? So there's I think big opportunity there. Part of the challenge is figuring out how do we get from here to there, and how can we help those companies think through those challenges. And that's something that we hope that our research will help inform.
Awesome, thank you, Valerie. And Mona, would love to bring you in with this next one, and also kind of circle back out to all that. I think, Mona, you were talking about a bit before, as far as what's really driving people away, or why are they not coming back? And so one of the questions from Professor C.B. Bhattacharya was, putting all of these perspectives together, would it be fair to say that greed is still the fundamental problem plaguing mankind?
Great, great thought there. You know, I've often thought of that as well. And when I was reading reports where minimum wage is going up, there was always an ask for more. All right. So, are we looking at greed in that aspect? And is greed playing a part? If we look at it that way, sometimes yes. I think again, I'm speaking post-pandemic most of the time, and it's because I believe that our associates and restaurant industry and hospitality industry in general has seen that in a way they were, you know, lesser paid than every other kind of, you know, over minimum wage that there is. And it's been going on. I mean, I've been in the industry for quite a few years, and I think I would always say, like, why are we the lowest on the totem pole? We're above the minimum wage, but why are we the lowest? But how is that equating to greed? In a sense, you give them the fair wage, you're giving them, you know, great packages, great benefit packages, well-being came into play so heavily, but there is still an ask for more. And is that because of greed, or is that because they've just always felt that, you know, with, in a way, slavery? Right? Does that play a part in people's minds? Is I think a great question that there is. Do not have an answer. You know, like we've been saying, I think the whole problem is really complex. What may be greed to me may not be greed to someone else. They might, you know, they can just think that, hey, I stand in a restaurant or in the hotel for about 10 hours a day. I am, you know, I'm deemed to get paid more. You're paying me for my services. I'm standing on my feet, but you pay me, I don't know, $15 an hour. I need more. How are we, you know, quantifying that as well? Like, I think, again, metrics and all of that kind of come into play. Don't have an answer, Professor. But I think that's the kind of thought that I have towards it. Again, with metrics as well, it's, you know, you can't really define it. Recently with sustainability and, you know, in that kind of space, I think we have some sort of standards that have come through, the science-based, you know, SBTIs that have come through. There isn't such a thing yet, as far as I'm aware, of how we can just one kind of standard metric across countries that can measure if the company is paying well, if the company is, you know, eradicating slavery, not going towards that. I don't think there is that such a thing. And when it comes to certifications, and I've spoken to so many people about what do you need? What more can I do for you? You know, just in terms human to human as well, not just in terms of companies. What more can I do for you? And often the answer is, well, maybe I should get paid more. And then I look back and say, well, I can't really do that right now. You know, we've raised everything. So where is that balance and how do we strike it? I think I don't have an answer yet.
I mean, I would say,
thank you, Mona.
Yeah, just on greed, I think we could also think more broadly. Does greed have to be about money? Can we be greedy for all of these things that we want to see happen in the workplace, on the sustainability front, on the, you know, good jobs, equity, sustainability, circular economy? I mean, you could sort of name your favorite list. I think people do get motivated and I'm glad that they're greedy for that kind of change.
Absolutely. So many kind of varied factors, right, Valerie? It's, you know, I'm sure for you and I, it's probably climate change and those kind of factors that we're more lean towards. You know, for Jessica, it may be something else. So just here amongst us, I think our kind of North Star is something else, and which is why I was like, everybody has a different perspective. And how do we get everything together is, I think, where the complexity lies in a way.
Can I pitch in 2 seconds, Chris? Looking at the clock, because greed, it's of course all about money and everything else. They're fine by the end of the day, but it's also about lack of transparency and not knowing. I'm not so sure whether it's greed necessarily. I don't believe modern slavery, if we fight that well, everything becomes more expensive and people make less money. I don't believe in that. We don't know what we can choose between. I think it's a lot, at least on the modern slavery, lack of transparency, lack of standards, lack of labels in the supermarket, so you know the good you buy indeed is made in freedom. And so I believe it's something else, not necessarily greed, but more specific related to the human rights part of it. Yeah.
Tony, I want to give you a chance to weigh in on this before I do a lightning round kind of question here to close us out before we all turn into pumpkins and move on with our Wednesday.
Yeah, it's been a great conversation. I'm just sitting here thinking about how complex all of this is. And I try to be a conscious consumer, but I find that I'm debating, is it polyester? Is it organic cotton? It almost comes down to what am I most concerned with? Water, people. So I think we're all dealing with a very complex scenario or situation. And it's difficult. You can easily focus on one area and extrapolate that that's going to have broad benefit over here. And it really isn't that way. And so have enjoyed this conversation, and it reinforces the complexity that all of it has woven inside of it. So I'll close with that.
Awesome. Thanks, Tony. So on closing notes, we did have one more question in there from Mateus around what is the best balance in exceeding or excelling in your career and taking space for your personal life. So personal balance. And I know each of you are amazing professionals in your own right. So whether it's a personal insight or something from your work, I would be curious on that front. And then I guess finally, just the call to action. These are wicked problems. We don't have the solutions yet. I'm curious to from each of your perspectives, how are you seeing companies or organizations, whomever, citizens, regulators, whomever, how are you seeing them working to find solutions? What seems to be working as far as an approach?
I guess I would just close by saying that, this has been tremendous to see so many different goals and perspectives on these topics. And I think after hearing this, I'm convinced that it's possible our North Stars are all in the same part of the sky. So we can kind of move in a direction. And as I think about this, from a personal and professional experience or from what I have found, could sort of move some of these issues forward is there's actually been research that shows that companies that are doing well on some of these sustainability metrics tend to do well on others, just in general. And so I think what we want to be spending time thinking about is, more deeply understanding sort of the cultural organizational culture antecedents. And part of this is about creating the sense of belonging. Is it about understanding why minority women have are less satisfied in the workplace post-COVID? I mean, when we start to think about these different metrics and indicators, I think we sort of need to bring it back and think about what are some of the roots that are common to all of these good things that a company can do, and nurture those as much as keep our eye on all of the evolving metrics. I agree with Jessica. It's about having information. I think it's also about having options. So if I'm divesting of if I'm an energy major, I want to divest of some of my dirtiest fossil energy projects. I need an option for those projects to actually not continue to operate in a dirty manner. And I don't want to feed the problem just through. So I mean, as you think about it, we can build good organizations. We want to have a sort of broader view on how our decisions are how those decisions reflect our own organizational culture and how they propagate out in the marketplace and send signals about sort of who we are and what we want to do.
Yeah, real quick, one thing I'm seeing, Chris, it works really well is I feel like there's a mindset that communal challenges require communal response. And so these companies are getting together, realizing that we don't have the answer, nor should we have the answer. And we're working in partnership with other organizations, even competitors, to come up with solutions. And I think that's one of the ways forward that's going to help us address some of the complexity that we're dealing with. It can't be done. The walls of the organization need to be much more porous. and bringing in resources and teaming up with others to get solutions.
Yeah, absolutely, Tony. It's all about collaboration. It's all about everybody pitching in and trying to make the difference. But I agree with you, Valerie. It's also about having the option, and how can you get the option if you don't know what you can choose between? And I think that's about getting towards standards, listening to the workforce truly and throughout the entire supply chain, find mechanisms to do that and make that scalable. And by the end of the day, it's about leading, it's about listening to the workforce, it's about consumers, investors, everyone else to pitch in. We all individually have a role to play, but I agree, Valerie, we need to be able to get a choice when we buy something in the supermarket. Is it good or is it not made through decent work? Yeah.
No, I couldn't agree more, with everything that's been said. I often say that sustainability cannot be achieved without collaboration. And I think one key pillar of sustainability is people. So I think it's that time now where we've done a lot, and of course a long way to go in terms of planet. But I think now, those standards, getting together, solving these complex problems that we've just seen in just under an hour. But how do we all get together, get some standard out there and solve this problem and make that, just a holistic approach in a sense. And, if there's, we've been chatting about labeling and how can we pick something that has that accurate labeling, little things that have come through as well in this conversation, but long way to go. But I just think that we can do it in collaboration, whether it be competition. And I've often seen in sustainability and just, talking about carbon footprint and emissions as well, for food service especially, you're going down this whole supply chain. And if I don't collaborate with, I'm using two big examples, a Pepsi and a Coca-Cola, competition right there, but I need them to collaborate with me. There's no hook or crook there. So I think similar in this kind of space as well.
Awesome. Well, with that, I want to be respectful of everyone's mornings. It's supposed to be a primer for the day to get everyone going and thinking about stuff. So thank you all for joining the Center for Sustainable Business in this conversation about the wicked problems impeding thriving work for all and kicking off our Workforce 100 work stream. Happy Wednesday to everybody. And thank you all for the conversation. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you all.